and we're ready to officially go back on the record. So court will officially be in session at this point. I believe that when we left off yesterday, we were in the middle of Ms. Moss's direct examination of Ms. Strock. Ms. Moss, can you hear me okay?
Yes, Your Honor.
And if we could go ahead and let Ms. Strock into the courtroom. Are there any matters that we need to take up prior to resuming that testimony?
Not from legislative defendants, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Strock, can you hear me okay?
I can, Your Honor.
All right, and I can hear you loud and clear as well. I also see you there. Okay, great. So, Ms. Moss, you may ask your next question of this witness.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Strock.
Good morning, Ms. Moss.
Thank you for joining us again. If we could turn back to JX 878, and Ms. Hardiman, if you could bring that back up for us. Okay. And if we could just go through the first several slides, if you could take a look at those and let me know, Ms. Strock, do these accurately represent some of the efforts that the State Board of Election made to publicize the requirements of the prior photo ID law under HB 589?
Yes, they do.
If I want to turn now to the training efforts that were made with respect to House Bill 589. Does the North Carolina State Board of Election have responsibility for overseeing the administration of elections by the 100 county boards of election?
Yes.
And in preparing to administer the photo identification requirements of House Bill 589 in the 2016 elections, did the State Board of Elections develop training curricula?
Yes, we did. We did that in advance of the 2016 elections, and we did that in conjunction with the county boards of elections, their directors and staff.
Why did you do it in conjunction with the county boards of elections, their directors and staff?
Well, because traditionally, and was the case in 2016, county boards train their own election officials. The state board does not train the precinct officials of the county boards. That's just tradition. That is a responsibility of the county board. But what we wanted to understood with the implementation of the photo ID requirement for the first time, we wanted to make sure that the training that was provided to all precinct officials and election officials across the state was uniform and consistent, because we wanted to make sure that it was rolled out in a way that everyone received the same information and that it was correct information. And so we worked with the counties to sort of understand from their best practices what works best for them in training, what would work best for 100 counties, and how we put together video modules that we required all county boards to use during their precinct training for the 2016 March primary. We also put together other training tools, including a station guide that was the idea of one of the county directors, that had the idea that she thought that would be something that would provide scripts to the training, to the precinct officials, so that for every thing that they would encounter in that precinct, they would have a script that they could read from, and so that would ensure consistency. And the other directors in our focus groups thought that was a great idea, so that is what we produced and provided to all counties for every single polling location in their county.
How many on election day, in approximately how many precincts are there across the state?
Well, in 2016, I believe there were in excess of 2,700.
And approximately how many poll workers and election officials needed to be trained before the March 2016 primary?
Well, you have the officials that work during one stop and on election day, and our calculations were that more than 20,000 election officials received training for the March 15 primary.
Based upon your experience in administering numerous elections, is it practical for the State Board of Elections to be able to personally train over 20,000 election officials?
It's definitely not practical, and I don't think it's certainly something I don't think the state board, even if they had the resources to do it, I don't know that that would be the best way. I don't believe that it would be the best way to train precinct officials, and the reason is because counties know their precinct officials. A lot of these precinct officials have worked for years in their elections. They understand their strengths, they know their weaknesses, they know where they're best positioned to work. And so they are really sort of the best instructor for the precinct officials, because they're also somebody they trust. So I think we thought it was important to provide them the tools and the resources, but it was most appropriate for the county boards to actually the staff and the directors and their staff to train their precinct officials in their county.
While you allowed the county boards of elections to train the precinct officials and volunteers in their counties, did the State Board of Elections have any involvement in that training that was conducted?
Yes, because it was important for us to, basically, we had put the resources together. We wanted to make sure they understand how to use them. And so what we did is we conducted several, to my recollection, what we would call sort of train the trainer webinars. And those webinars were, we invited all the directors, we invited their staff, we invited their county board members, we invited their precinct officials if they wanted to attend too. And so that was our opportunity to not basically conduct precinct training, but to explain and train them on the resources that we had provided and that we were mandating that they use in their training.
Did the reasonable impediment process or form, was that a feature at all of the training that was developed before the March 2016 primary?
Absolutely. That was a prominent part of our training because that was a new provisional reason that people could vote.
And is the method of training that you used known as train the trainer?
That's what we believe. That's what we called it. Yes.
And are there any other reasons why you opted for the method of using the train the trainer model to conduct training before the March 2016 primary?
Well, as I've testified, I mean, I think the primary reason is because, first of all, the staff, we do not have the resources at the state board to oversee the training of over 20,000 election officials. But that aside, it's preferable for the counties to train their own staff. That is something they have done. They do. They have different, counties are unique. And so it's important for them to have the flexibility of also, you need to use these resources, but some counties, the larger counties, might decide to train certain officials at a different time than they train other officials. And that's how they have traditionally done it, and it works for them. So we wanted to give them some flexibility in how they conducted the training, but we wanted to make sure that the content was uniform and consistent. And so that was why it was another good reason for them to conduct it themselves.
Based upon your experience, when is the optimal time to conduct training before an upcoming election?
It's always optimal to train precinct officials just in advance of when they're going to have to carry out those duties. I mean, people, I think, understand that especially precinct officials that work on election day are not, they're not staff usually of the county boards. They only work during elections, sometimes only work on election day. And so it's important for them to get training on the laws that will be being administered and in effect during the election that they are working. And so that's often just before the election that they're going to they're going to be working in.
Okay. Given that consideration that you want to do the training as close to the election as the rules that you're training on are going to be in place, did that present any additional concerns for the state board in attempting itself to train the 20,000 plus precinct officials and workers that would be administering the law in the March 2016 primary?
Well, exactly. If the state board was going to take on that mandate to, in fact, administer the training to all 100 county boards, it would be most difficult for them to do that in the same sort of time period that they would want to do it, and that the county boards were conducting their own training. You would have 100 counties that are basically conducting this precinct training at about the same time. So it would be that the state board would have to do that with 100 counties, and it wouldn't be feasible.
And you mentioned the station guide that was developed before the March 2016 primary. Did that station guide, or did a station guide continue to be used after the March 2016 primary?
Yes. The purpose of the station guide was not just for the photo identification requirements. The station guide contains scripts for other functions that happen at the polling site. In fact, there are station guides at the help station, there are station guides in the check-in, and they have all the different things that the precinct official will encounter. So after 2016, or actually at the general election of the 2016, when the photo identification requirement was not in effect, those materials were removed from the station guides, and the other responsibilities they had were still maintained and used.
Did they continue to be maintained and used through all the elections that you administered until you left as executive director of the State Board of Elections?
Yes, yes.
Did you also develop something known as the Election Official Handbook?
Yes.
Can you describe for the court what that is?
The Election Official Handbook was it was more in depth. It was sort of what we sort of consider sort of the encyclopedia for that precinct or that polling station, that had more details about things that they may encounter. So if something came up during the election, we tried to have a resource there that they could go to, in addition to contacting their county board or state board. But we wanted them to have a resource guide that really touched almost anything that would happen in that precinct.
Based on your years of experience administering elections, including an election that required photo identification, and your years of experience working directly with the county boards of elections, the members and the directors, do you have an opinion as to whether those counties will be able to fairly and evenly administer the new photo identification law?
Objection calls for speculation. Objection, improper lay testimony.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Sure.
She is being asked to provide her opinion based upon her years of experience as an election administrator in North Carolina who's worked with these individuals. And it is our position that that is appropriate lay testimony because it is based on her perceptions and her experience and her firsthand knowledge.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes, I'm getting some feedback. Ms. Strack, I don't know if you can maybe turn down your volume just a little bit on your speakers.
Sure.
Maybe what the feedback is coming from, I'm not sure. But if you could turn down the volume on your computer and still hear okay, that might help. I don't know. We can try that. It may still take me a second to rule on this, but Miss Moss, can you repeat that question? You're on mute.
Yes, Your Honor. My question was, and I may not be repeating it exactly, but my question was whether, based on her years of experience administering elections in North Carolina, working directly with the County Board of Election Directors and County Board members, whether she has an opinion based on that experience as to whether the counties will be able to fairly and evenly administer the requirements of the new photo identification law.
And Your Honor, my objection was twofold. Speculation. She hasn't been an election administrator in 2 years here in North Carolina. And this was the very kinds of expert opinions she offered in her expert report that this court excluded yesterday.
Okay, give me just 1 second. The objection is sustained. Ask your next question.
Your Honor, then if I may have her answer the question as a proffer.
Okay, you may answer the question.
Yes, my experience working with the county boards is that I don't know of a county that does not try to conduct their election fairly, consistently across the board. I believe they did that in 2016 and during my time there. So I believe that if they were again asked to implement any sort of election law, including Senate Bill 824, I believe they would do it fairly.
Thank you. And sorry to ask you to repeat, but since that question was under proffer, I'm going to ask you another question that may ask you to repeat a little bit. But based upon your experience during the elections that you administered, what was your experience with how the county boards administered those elections, and did they attempt to do so in a fair and even-handed manner?
The county boards did attempt to do so in a fair and even-handed manner. There will always be issues that happen in counties, but I never saw an instance where I believe that a county board was not acting in good faith and not trying to administer the election fairly.
I'd like to turn your attention now to the March 2016 primary that you were the election director for. Am I correct that that's the only statewide election in this state in which a photo ID law was in effect?
Actually, the congressional primary, all 100 counties were involved in that, and it was also used in that primary as well.
Okay, so the June primary was also a statewide primary?
Yes, so all 100 counties were involved in that.
Okay. All right, well then focusing on the March 2016 primary, how many people voted in that primary election?
Around 2.3 million people.
And do you know how many of those voters filled out a provisional ballot for any reason?
I believe that there was an excess of 40,000.
And do you have a general idea of how many voters filled out a provisional ballot because they did not have an ID?
There were voters that completed a provisional ballot because they didn't have an ID for not just photo ID, but there would be provisional voters that completed a provisional ballot because they didn't have, for instance, HAVA ID, or maybe they didn't have ID during that was required for same-day registration. So, are you speaking specifically about photo ID?
Well, let's start with the broader category, just ID in general.
So, ID in general, I think that I provided in a presentation to the legislature, there was around 1,248 that did so without a reasonable impediment, and 1,048, if I recall, that was a provisional ballot with a reasonable impediment declaration. So all of those would not have had ID to present at the time they voted.
Okay, and we'll look at that presentation again in a moment, but for now, can you please describe for the court what some of the reasons are why somebody would have had to vote a provisional ballot in the March 2016 primary?
Sure. The biggest reason that most people vote provisionally in any election that I've seen is no record of registration, that they they show up, they are not on the registration rolls. And if it's not during the one-stop period when they can same-day register, if they're on election day, we don't have election day registration, they would vote a provisional ballot, and the reason being no record of registration. You can also vote, you would also vote a provisional ballot if you did not vote in your assigned precinct, if you voted out of precinct. And therefore you would cast a ballot because that ballot style that you are eligible to vote might not be in that precinct. You can vote a provisional ballot if it's an unreported move, if you've moved and you've not updated your voter registration. Let's see, there out of precinct, unreported move, no record of registration, no ID provided, meaning is it, like, as I said, if you were to want to register during one stop in using same day registration, you're required to prove your identity, your residency. And so if you did not have a document to prove your residency, you would vote provisionally, and the reason you would vote would be no ID provided, no ID not provided.
And can you describe for the court, in your experience, how the provisional voting process works at a precinct if a voter needs to vote a provisional ballot for any one of the many reasons you've outlined?
Yes, and I can tell you how it worked during my time there, and I don't have any reason to think that it's different. But when a voter presents to vote and they check in and they give their name and address, if there is a reason that that voter is not on the registration roll or can't comply with some requirement, then they are sent to what we call the help station. The help station is there for basically those that can't go straight through and vote their ballot. And so if they would go to the help station, and then the precinct officials or election officials that work at the help station would assist them in voting a provisional ballot for whatever reason they're voting a provisional ballot.
In the two primaries, the two elections that you administered in which photo ID was required, were voters who lacked a required photo identification necessary to vote in either of those two elections, were they treated any differently than any other provisional, any other voter required to vote a provisional ballot?
Objection. Calls for speculation, lack of foundation. Was she there?
All right, give me just a second. The objection is sustained.
Ms. Strzok, did you visit any of the early voting sites during the March 2016 primary?
I think I did. I didn't personally visit many, but I do believe that I did visit at least one in Wake County, and it might have been there might have been a couple of others. But I primarily that did not visit precincts during that time.
Okay. During the one precinct or early voting place that you did visit in Wake County, did you observe provisional voters being treated differently based upon the reason they were voting a provisional ballot?
My recollection,
Objection. Lack of foundation. Did she know why they were voting provisionally?
Just 1 second. The objection's overruled. You may answer that question.
my recollections, I don't remember anyone specifically voting provisionally while I was there, but what all that I can say is that when I visited, the proper processes were being carried out to my knowledge, to my observation.
And was the way that the state board directed the counties to administer the voter ID requirements in the March and June primaries, did it mandate or require them to treat individuals that would be voting a provisional ballot that lacked an ID differently than any voters voting other types of provisional ballots?
No, the provisional ballots are handled at the help station. There was not a separate station for individuals that did not have acceptable ID. They were all handled as provisional ballots. at the help station.
So the direction to the county boards was not to set up a line or a window or desk that people without photo ID would have to go to exclusively?
No, it was the help station was for provisional voters, including those that may not have acceptable ID.
Does the State Board of Elections, or did the State Board of Elections during your tenure maintain data on the provisional ballots that were cast in the March 2016 primary?
Yes, provisional data is maintained in the state's statewide election information management system. It's one of the modules that the counties have access and input their provisional data.
And once that provisional data is input into, and is it input into the SEAMS system that we've heard about?
Yes.
Okay. Can that data be extracted from the SEAMS system into a report?
Yes, it actually is in a couple of different ways. It is extracted for staff at the state board on a daily basis during the canvassing period of the County Board of Elections. It's a report that the provisional data, some of that data goes to certain staff members, or it did at the time that I was there. And then after the election, or actually during the canvassing, there is a public spreadsheet that is on the state board's FTP site that shows the provisional voters. It doesn't have confidential information, but that spreadsheet comes from data that has been inputted by the counties into the SEAMS system.
And is there a spreadsheet that does contain confidential voter information that was available to you and to other members of the State Board of Elections during the March and June primaries?
Yes, the data that we received, we would receive the confidential information.
And to your knowledge, is the spreadsheet that was produced in discovery in this case that was designated Holmes SBOE _POD _003996 highly confidential provisional voter 2016-602, the data on provisional ballots that you reviewed during the March 2016, about the March 2016 primary?
I certainly reviewed that spreadsheet online, but I also reviewed the reports that were more specific to the staff members on a daily basis, which shows really the activity of the counties and what are they approving their provisional ballots, what progress they're making. So, but it's still the same data. It's just it's pulled different ways for different purposes.
Okay. And did you review the spreadsheet back in 2016?
Yes.
And does that spreadsheet include information about provisional ballots that were accompanied by a reasonable impediment form?
Yes, it does have that data in it.
Did you personally review any reasonable impediment forms that were submitted as part of the March 2016 primary back in 2016 when you were the executive director?
I did.
I would now like to show you a demonstrative exhibit that we have created labeled LXD 258. If we could zoom in on that so we can see the columns, the titles of the columns. Okay. Go back to the first column, please. Okay. So, Ms. Strzok, representing to you that this is a demonstrative that was made from the highly confidential provisional voter spreadsheet that we've been discussing. Since that spreadsheet contains highly confidential information, we didn't want, obviously, to publish it in court openly. But if you could walk us through some of the columns that would be contained in that spreadsheet and let us know what those columns mean. I'd like to start with column A.
Sure.
PVID. What is that?
The provisional ID it's a unique number per county. So it's not a unique number throughout the state. It's a unique number, and it's the ID of the provisional that's assigned to the voter that votes provisionally in a county. For example, in Dare County, the provisional voter 1420, that's a unique number. There will only be one Dare County provisional ID of 1420. However, that 1420 could be in another county. So the provisional ID is unique within the county.
Okay. And then column C, what does that tell us?
That's the county that the provisional voter voted in.
And then several columns are hidden for purposes of being able to fit this on the screen. Can you tell us what column G represents?
Right. G and H are really the same thing. G is the label that we give the provisional reasons, with H being the actual description of what that region is. So NROR is no record of registration. IDNP is no acceptable ID. And an incorrect precinct is the IPCT. So those are the labels, and then the description is in H.
And the IDMP, no acceptable ID, does that refer solely to photo identification required under House Bill 589, or could that also include the HARA documentation that you were referencing?
Yes, it's any reason that any type of ID or documentation that would have been required of the voter to cast a ballot. If they did not have it, that would be the reason. Most likely the precinct official would show as the reason they're voting provisionally.
Okay. Then column J, voter registration number, I can represent to you, and that's what the star on the demonstrative means, that we have redacted those numbers. But what would normally be in that column?
If the voter had a voter registration number in the system, then that number would be in column J. If they didn't, so as no record of registration, you wouldn't see a voter registration number likely in that field.
Okay. And then column L, voted date, what does that tell us?
That's the date during the election period that the provisional voter cast their ballot.
If a voter cast a provisional ballot during early voting, would that be reflected by the date, by a different date in that column?
Yes.
Okay. And then if we can, I think we see last name, first name, middle name. I think those are self-explanatory, but if we could then focus on column S.
Right.
Is out of county address. What is that?
That's if the address is out of that county, that address is not in that county, you would see a true, and usually that means that they are not registered in that county.
And then skipping over to column AO, DL number. Again, any data in that column has been redacted for confidentiality reasons or removed for confidentiality reasons, but can you tell us what DL number is and what would be in that column if it had data?
Yes, if the DL was provided or was in the data, that field would be populated.
Okay, and then the next column, AU, US citizen. Can you tell us what that column contains?
The citizenship question is asked with voter registrations, and if the U.S. citizen is populated with true or false, that would provide some indication of what the precinct official received from that interaction with the voter. But I would say that I would not always consider that column accurate. You might want to look into it, but I would not consider that, to mean that the voter is not a U.S. citizen.
would you want to look at other data sources to confirm that fact rather than relying solely on this spreadsheet?
Absolutely.
And then column AV, what does that column tell us?
The provisional application, in order for a provisional ballot to count, the application has to be signed. And this is a column that truly the staff member that's inputting the data into SEAMS would use to show whether the applicant signed the provisional application. True or false.
And then column AX, where it says comments, what is that column used for?
It's really, it's sort of an open field for county boards to put any sort of comments that that came from usually the precinct official side of what they can get from the documentation they've received from the precinct official or the election official.
Can that column be helpful in understanding what happened with a particular provisional ballot?
Yes, and I think that's the reason why the comments are there, because if there's information that is included with the provisional application or any document with that provisional application that would give any understanding of that interaction with the voter, usually the counties will want to put some sort of comments there so that they can have a better understanding of what happened with that voter.
Okay. And then column BC, vote counted, what does that tell us?
That is ultimately how the county board, they go in once they have, the county board has made their decision on the disposition of a provisional ballot. They indicate that in this column. Whether it was counted fully would be a yes, whether it was not counted would be an N, and a P means that that ballot was partially counted.
And is this column reliable?
It can be, and but there are, it is dependent on the county board after these meetings going back in and updating the provisional table. So it's generally pretty accurate, but there will be occasions when the county boards will fail to update it. Sometimes you will find that the information in this column is not 100%.
And in those instances, what would you do to determine if a vote had actually, if a voter's ballot had actually counted or not? Is there anything else you could look to?
What you can look to is another part of the SEAMS system is voter history. And the voter history is something that is publicly available on the state board's website. So you can check, basically you're checking the registration of that voter. And then on that registration, on that tab on the registration file, there is a place for voter history. So then you can see which elections that voter voted in, and it would only be there if the vote counted. And so then if you see that something was no in the vote counted, but you see voter history, you would know that even though this would say no, the ballot was actually counted.
Okay. And then column BE, what does that tell us?
It's the reason description that the ballot was not counted, which is different from maybe the reason that they voted provisionally. That's determined by the precinct official. This column is not determined by the precinct official. This is basically after the disposition of the provisional ballot. The reason that the county board decided to count it would not have any comment, but if they didn't count it, they would provide a reason, a description of why the county board did not fully count it. And even if they partially counted, they would explain why it was only partially counted.
Okay. And then if we can scroll a little bit further over, all right, that's good. Column BF, what does that tell us? The column other reason.
And usually this is additional information, because there may be that you will see information here. Sometimes a voter will vote provisionally for more than one reason. The voter maybe doesn't show up as being registered on the poll book. And if you had, in this election, if you had to show photo ID, what would happen was you would want, in case, because sometimes when you don't have a voter that shows up on the poll book, after research is conducted by the state board, the county boards in conjunction with data help from the DMV, you will find that the person actually is registered. So if they are then registered, you would want to make sure that they had complied with, in this instance, the photo ID requirement. So other reason would be if you had usually more than one reason that a person voted provisionally, just ensuring that all of those boxes were checked.
Okay. And then skipping over to column BM Bravo Mike, what does is reasonable impediment tell us?
This column was added with the photo ID requirement. This is a column that if the voter voted provisionally and did not complete a reasonable impediment declaration, that would show a false. And if they did complete a reasonable impediment declaration in conjunction with their provisional ballot, it would be true.
Okay. And then the next two columns, BN and BO, what do those tell us?
This would be the reason that they said that they voted provisionally. And on the reasonable impediment form in 2016, there were a number of check boxes on that form. And those check boxes would have been pre-populated for use for the label of a reason. And then there was an other. So you would have the ability to either put what was checked, or if they described it in the line, that you could put that as well later.
Okay. And all of these columns of data from the spreadsheet that we've been discussing, can they be filtered? So for example, if we only wanted to look at provisional ballots where column Bravo Mike is reasonable impediment is designated as true, can you sort the spreadsheets to get at that kind of information?
Yes, and that's a very common thing that we would do at the state board, and I'm sure that people that that look at the data from the state board site could do that as well. The ability to do that is there.
And does the numbers that you get depend upon how you filter the spreadsheet and what specific columns you're looking at?
Absolutely, because it's really important to understand that in this table you have, I call it sort of two sides of it. You've got what the precinct official or the election official determined was what they believed the reason the voter voted provisionally, and then you've got the reason that the county board counted or didn't count that ballot. And so sometimes those reasons are not in sync, or maybe the precinct official didn't determine the right reason, but when the county board does their research, they ultimately find that it's a different reason, or that the individual can be counted. So you have to look. You can't just look at one column and believe that gives you a total understanding of what's in this table. You have to look at a combination of the columns if you're trying to answer a particular question.
And Ms. Hardiman, you can take this exhibit down for now. And if we could bring back up JX 878. This is the presentation that you gave to the General Assembly. And if we could go to slide or page 32. In this presentation, do you see where you state that this is a review of 2016 primary data?
Yes.
To your knowledge, what was this data based upon?
Well, my knowledge was that we were providing information to the legislature about that of the voters that did not present photo ID, and whether it was with the reasonable impediment or not. The 1248 was a number that was pulled from the data division for this presentation, which was determined that 1248 voters did not present acceptable or execute a reasonable or return. So this number would represent those voters that appeared, did not complete a reasonable impediment declaration, and voted provisionally with the ability to bring that ID back before canvass, but they did not return. And these votes did not count. That's what that data says.
And is the 1248 that did not present acceptable photo identification limited to those that did not present photo ID required under House Bill 589, or does that include individuals who didn't provide HAVA documentation?
I believe some of those no acceptable IDs for other reasons other than photo ID are included in that number. As I said, if you just pulled the column no acceptable ID, you would get more than just those that didn't provide photo ID.
Okay. And then this spreadsheet indicates that there were 2.7 million voters that participated in the 2016 primary. Do you know what that number?
I believe I do. There were 2.3 million that voted in the March primary, but as I recall, there were around 500,000 that, or close to that, in the June primary. I believe that was an attempt to include both, but it is not accurately characterized there, because if that were true, it should say 2016 primaries. That's the best explanation I have for that number.
I see. So if I'm understanding correctly, it should say primaries, or it should say 2.3 million.
Yes, and based on that 1248 number, I think it should say 2.3 million.
If this were corrected to the 2.3 million number, what percentage of voters that did not present acceptable photo identification or execute a reasonable impediment declaration and did not return to the county office by the deadline after election night, and whose votes didn't count, what percentage of voters does that 1,248 represent?
I am not certain I know precisely. It is less than 0.5%, I'm certain. It may be 0.05%.
Okay. If we could go, oh, sorry. If we could go up one slide to, I think it'd be 31. Okay. So in this particular slide, Ms. Strack, what was being provided to the legislature with respect to these numbers? What does this represent?
This number is that 1,048 voters.
Oh.
Excuse me.
You blipped out on us from.
Sorry.
Ms. Struck, if you could back up for a moment, you bleeped out on us, so I'm certain the court reporter didn't hear you. If you could start over.
Sure. This indicates that in the March primary that there were 1,048 voters that completed a reasonable impediment declaration. And the bottom part of that is that 864 of those 1048 ultimately counted.
I'm sorry, did you say 1048 ultimately counted?
No, I said 864 ultimately counted.
Okay. And so if I'm doing my math correctly, does that leave 184 provisional ballots accompanied by a reasonable impediment form that did not count?
That's correct.
And I'm going to ask you more about that data, but before we get into that, can you please describe for the court what the requirements were for a voter to have their provisional ballot and accompanying reasonable impediment declaration counted under the voter ID law that was in effect during the March 2016 primary?
Yes. So the voter would have to complete the paperwork of a provisional voter, which is a provisional application. And they would also have to complete a separate form, which was the reasonable impediment declaration. And we couldn't get it all on one form. So you had two separate forms. And the reasonable impediment declaration was a form that contained the voter's name, and then they would have to either check a box of there were certain reasonable impediment reasons to obtaining photo identification that were listed in the statute in House Bill 589. And the statute required.
Sorry, I'm sorry, you're booked out again.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If I can read you back, okay. There were certain reasonable impediment reasons to obtaining photo identification that were listed in the statute in House Bill 589. And then wait.
Yes, and there then were the statute provided the voter the ability to describe their reasonable impediment, and we had an other line. So they would need to identify a reasonable impediment to obtaining photo identification. And then the statute required that they provide what was called alternative identification. And that could be the last four of their social and their date of birth. Or if they didn't want to provide that, they could provide what we called a HAVA document. So it could be a utility bill or a paycheck or a voter registration card. There were several documents that they could have provided that would satisfy the alternative identification requirement. And then they would have to sign the reasonable impediment declaration, which is attesting that the information in the declaration is true.
Were there any prohibitions on a voter providing a nonsensical statement or a statement that merely denigrated the law?
Right.
I was going to say in the prior.
Excuse me.
HB 589.
Yes, in House Bill 589, one of the reasons that a ballot would not count is if simply the voter put some sort of nonsensical statement on it or was just making a derogatory statement about the law. The reason being, I don't like was that said a county board should not count a reasonable impediment declaration or a provisional ballot with one if that's simply what the voter indicated on the form.
Ms. Moss, if you could ask her to repeat.
Yeah, Ms. Strzok, I'm sorry, but your internet is going in and out, so we're not getting your complete answer. It's lagging.
Let me interject just 1 minute. Ms. Strzok,
Yes,
are you on a hard line or a Wi-Fi?
I'm on Wi-Fi. I'm the only person in the house, so there's no one else on the internet.
Do you have other applications that are running?
I don't believe so, but I can certainly, I don't believe so.
Sometimes that's the issue. Your volume is also still, it seems really strong.
I'll try to find a way to cut that down. I apologize. I cut the speaker volume down, but I think that I need to cut. There's a microphone, but it doesn't give me the ability to turn it down. So what I could do at the break is I have another computer. I could try that and see, and I have AirPods and see if that would cut down on the problem. I'd be happy to do that.
Sometimes AirPods or earphones work fairly well. I know with others that have testified, having earphones in has really helped, especially with the feedback problem. So
I'm happy to try that.
Maybe you could try that right now.
Yes, I'll do that right now.
Did we lose her completely? Miss
I-
Moss?
I don't see her. She may be trying to get on a different computer.
I was thinking,
That she was just going to try the AirPods.
right, I didn't mean for her to completely check out.
No.
I just saw that problem continuing to seemingly get worse. And so rather than try to get through it and be frustrated, it would be nice if we could resolve the issue and go forth smoothly. Yeah, she's no longer in the courtroom that I see as far as the participants. I tell you what, why don't we go ahead and take about 5 or 10 minutes and try to let her set up, and we can keep the session live. And so when she comes back on, we can let her back in the courtroom, and maybe you can speak to her a little bit and see if there's any issues or see if it helps. But why don't we take about a 10-minute break? It's now 10:27. We'll just come back around 10:40. How's that? 10:40. Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor.